Hello, my name is Thomas. Welcome to British Culture. Albion Never Dies. This episode is How British is Star Wars? I've done over 100 episodes on British culture asking what is Britishness, and I thought maybe it's now time to start moving into the territory of what isn't. Where are the limits? Not everything in the universe that I like is British. I don't want this to end up as a bit like the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding, where there's the Greek-American father who argues that everything in the universe was created by the ancient Greeks, and it becomes a bit of a kid's game. His kids start to ask him, okay, the car garage, how did the ancient Greeks invent that? And of course he'd always have an answer, but that was part of the joke. So, is there something in the universe that I really like and absolutely isn't British? Well, this is the question. How British is Star Wars? I thought I'd need some kind of rubric, some way to fairly judge the film in its Britishness. And funnily enough, there is a rubric available from the BFI, the British Film Industry, the official organisation, which of course, passing this test can lead to tax credits. Very, very important. Now, of course, this is a relatively recent rubric that they use, and I'm going to retrospectively apply it to the original 1977 film. Of course, it's become too big, too unwieldy to try and apply it to the entire Star Wars universe. So I thought, let's narrow it down to the very first one, the first movie, released in 1977, with a very limited release, has to be said. The studio massively underestimated how popular it would be. People often talk about how people queued around the block to see it, but that is actually partly because there were only about 200 prints for the whole of North America, so it was the later release, 1978, which hit really big. But I've seen this referred to as the all-American movie, which I find really interesting. I mean, I have to say, as a child, I never particularly thought of it as an American movie or a British movie or anything else. I mean, obviously you have the three main stars. They are American: Luke Skywalker, Han Solo. Of course, Princess Leia, she puts on a British-ish accent for her public speaking voice, and it's really interesting to compare her accent when she's, say, speaking to Darth Vader in the hall, where she puts on her senatorial voice, and then her kind of private voice when she's speaking to Luke. That does change. But of course you've got Alec Guinness, very British accent, C-3PO, Grand Moff Tarkin, a whole range of different accents throughout it. It's not mono-accented, which Star Trek can tend to be. I say with my limited viewing of Star Trek, obviously you've got Picard and Scotty in two different series, and of course Doctor Who is set in a completely British universe. It's very rare to have someone who isn't either English or Welsh, as it is filmed by BBC Wales, I believe. Again, Whovians correct me. Whovian, of course, is the term for a Doctor Who fan. Trekkie is the term for a Star Trek fan. So what's the term for a Star Wars fan? A human being. Anyway, it does feel, Star Wars, like an Arthurian legend in outer space. That would, of course, suggest that it is more British than American. But let's start off with my very honest view. I think of Star Wars as a George Lucas creation. I don't see this as a very national creation, but since one gets talked about, people do talk about Star Wars as the classic American movie, so why not take the other view? And as I say, this is all about Britishness, this whole podcast, and if you're asking what is Britishness, it's worth asking sometimes, what isn't it? You must have a negative definition at some point. So, the BFI rubric. Section A, there are four sections. Section A looks at cultural content. I'll just go through it briefly now, and then I'll go through it in detail. A1, a film set in the UK or the European Economic Area. A2, lead characters British or EEA citizens or residents. A3, film based on British or EEA subject matter or underlying material. And A4, underlying dialogue, recorded mainly in English or UK indigenous language, or EEA language. Okay, so fairly strict rubric there for section A. Of course, there'll be a B, C and D coming up later. Let's look at A1, a film set in the UK or in the European Economic Area. These points are not evenly distributed. This is worth a whole 4 points out of 32. This is a big hitter. And no, Star Wars is set in a fictitious location in a galaxy far, far away, and fictitious locations are not included as British. Of course, it's not necessary to have this to pass. Quantum of Solace, for example, did pass the overall test, although it's largely set overseas. 2009's The Dark Knight, set in Gotham, a fictitious US city, and supposedly set in the US, actually passes the BFI test. The Narnia movie is obviously set in, well, Narnia, so that passed the test. Even, and this is interesting, a movie called American Hero, which is set in America, about an American hero, but was produced in the UK, so it passed on later categories. And of course, House of Gucci, about the Italian fashion house, and with some major American stars in it, actually passed the overall BFI test. So Section A1 is not necessary to pass in order to get your movie in as a British movie, but the setting, in the original film, Tatooine, the Death Star, various spaceships, that doesn't pass A1. A2, lead characters, British or EEA citizens. Okay, that's a no. That's a clear no. A citizen of Tatooine is not a citizen of the UK. Somebody from Corellia, somebody from Alderaan, and so on. No, absolutely not. Oh dear. First two are clear fails. But then we get into Section A3, a film based on British or EEA subject matter or underlying material, worth a total of 4 points. So this begs the question, is Star Wars culturally set in Britain? Well, here I have to start arguing my case, and I should say I have no particular connection to the BFI. I am simply using their rubric to guide my own thought process. So, is Star Wars culturally British? Well, you have a princess being rescued from a Dark Lord by a farm boy who dreams of being some kind of knight with the help of an old wizard, a scoundrel, and a pair of servants, one who talks too much and one who is mute, communicating in a series of whistles. All of these things could very much be an Arthurian legend or some other old British legend. Here, I think it's worth looking at J.R. Tolkien's writing. Tolkien, in his book, well, it's now been published in a collection, Tales from the Perilous Realm, he has his essay, which I think is fantastic, called On Fairy Stories. Star Wars seems very much to fit the definition of a fairy story more than, say, science fiction. I mentioned Star Trek earlier. I find relatively few people who love Star Trek like Star Wars as a second. Equally, people who love Star Wars kind of as a primary love very rarely have Star Trek. It tends to go into Tolkien's work. So I find Tolkien's work on fairy tales quite interesting, and this is his academic work. He's not talking necessarily about Lord of the Rings, he's talking about fairy, the location. He wrote, "The definition of a fairy story, what it is or what it should be, does not depend on any definition or historical account of elf or fairy, but upon the nature of fairy, the perilous realm itself, and the air that blows in that country. I will not attempt to define that, nor to describe it directly. It cannot be done. Fairy cannot be caught in a net of words, for it is one of its qualities to be indescribable, though not imperceptible. It has many ingredients, but analysis will not necessarily discover the secret of the whole." I would argue very definitely that Star Wars is set in a fairy realm rather than a science fiction realm, and especially going off Tolkien's kind of essay in full. There is a book called The Magic of Myth, which was written to accompany the Smithsonian exhibition in the late 90s. It argued that Star Wars was based on Arthurian legends. It did, of course, touch on the Japanese influence, and a huge amount gets written about that, especially because Lucas looked up to the Japanese filmmaker Akira Kurosawa. I would argue that rarely gets into the mythology of it, which is a relatively small part of the original film and the cinematography, but not the overall structure. That, of course, came from Joseph Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces, among other things. Among other writings from Joseph Campbell, and perhaps Vladimir Prop for the characters. That, of course, suggests that Lucas was inspired by some Russian fairy tale characters if he was reading Prop. Nonetheless, I would say that Star Wars is very much set in something that we would recognise with knights, dark lords, princesses, within our own cultural context. Yes, it has a dash from Japan, and yes, it has a dash from Lucas's own admiration for Wild West stories, but of course, The Wild West, in actual historicity, only lasted maybe a generation or two, and a lot of the stories we associate have been drawn from Arthurian legends and indeed Akira Kurosawa. So I would say out of it all, I'm going to perhaps be generous and give myself a good 3 out of 4 points here and say Star Wars culturally is kind of set in a British location, or one that we could all understand through looking at British fairy tales. Of course, I'm maybe being a bit generous there, but why not? Why not? We'll come back to that. Section A4, the last of the cultural content, talks about original dialogue recorded mainly in English or in UK indigenous language, for example Gaelic or Welsh, or an EA language. This is up to 6 points. This is pretty important. Do you hear a British voice? Well, you have Obi-Wan Kenobi with a very strong British accent, Tarkin with a very clear British accent, C-3PO, which is interesting because originally C-3PO was going to have a New York accent, and it was Anthony Daniels on set providing the voice and providing the body. You can read more about this in The Making of Star Wars by J.W. Rinsler, and this talks about how the location ended up being based in the UK, which here's the right page. Because Lucas had elected to film in England, it was only natural that local actors to be cast in many of the supporting roles. Here Anthony Daniels speaks. My agent rang up and she said there was this man called George Lucas making a space film. Do you want to go and see him? She said they're very interested because I'm good at mime. She talked a lot about the film, and she said the only trouble was the part was a robot. So I said, oh, come on, I'm a serious actor. We've got to get on with my career, don't we? But I went to Fox and met George, and I must say that I did immediately like him. We greeted each other, then there was silence. Fortunately for both of us, the production paintings were on the wall facing George. So I turned to the pictures and asked him about them, and he opened up and became quite dynamic. His excitement spilled over, and it was about an hour later when my meeting ended. A couple of days later, I picked up a script and read it for the first time, and it took me a long time to read, so I thought I'd better read it again. After reading it 3 times, I wrote out the story in sections, and when I got to understand vaguely what it was about, I became very excited about the character C-3PO. I realised he was not an ordinary robot, and began to forget all of my original ideas about playing a robot. His enthusiasm for playing the part obviously spilled over. He did a phenomenal job, but still, the original idea of him having a New York accent was very much in Lucas's mind, so he did bring in a voice actor once the filming had completed, to look at the film, to work out what kind of voice. It was one of the, a guy who provided voices for animations, and eventually tried out a bunch of different voices, but said, look, the guy on the set, you should probably just get him to do the voice. So we end up with a very British-sounding C-3PO. Interesting to consider how the feel of the film would be quite different if it was a guy with a New York accent. There is often, and I feel this is kind of the copy-paste element of the media, there's often an idea that maybe the bad guy should speak with a British accent and the good guy should speak with an American accent. It didn't really carry it across, mainly because of the limited number of American actors who came over. That was partly due to British unions and partly due to budget constraints. And so you find this Ivan Kershner, who came in to direct The Empire Strikes Back, also tried to include this to a point, and they were thinking of the old kind of sword and sandal epics, where you might get the Romans to speak in a British accent, and then, say, the rebellious slaves like Spartacus speaking with an American accent. Even in Stanley Kubrick's Spartacus, this doesn't quite work all the time. And in the Star Wars expanded universe, it's been explained away. Well, in the central civilized parts of the universe, say where Kenobi's from, then they speak with this clear accent, and then in the Outer Rim, they speak with what we consider an American accent. So that's become the in-universe explanation. But it's an interesting thing. There is a diversity of accents, which I think is pretty important considering this is supposed to be a whole galaxy. So, how much is English? I would say about half. But I'm not going to go through the movie bit by bit and time it and work out how many lines are in British English and American English. I'm going to say it's pretty well half. So that's 3 points out of 6. And I will get back to these points if you're not exactly keeping tabs on this. So, that was Section A, which is a significant part of the rubric. This next part, Section B, talks about cultural contribution. So their definition is the film demonstrates British creativity, British heritage, and or diversity. It's up to 4 points. So, the British Council wrote this. Britain punches above its weight when it comes to creativity. Despite containing less than 1% of the world's population, it has one of the largest creative industry sectors. Throughout the world, our films, adverts and TV shows captive audiences, our architecture surprises and delights, and our fashion continues to challenge and innovate. I'd say that's very, very true, as I've travelled all around the world, whether I'm in Saudi Arabia, Oman, mainland China, Hong Kong, Turkey. Everybody's heard of us. We're less than 1% of the population. Not only have they heard of us, but they often have very clear ideas about Scotland, England, London, and so on. Sometimes people are even apologetic about not knowing really the difference between England and Scotland, which seems extraordinary to me because we are less than 1%. Everywhere I go, everyone's heard of us and has an idea, some idea, of Britishness. So where would that contribution be in Star Wars? Well, it references the fashions. Of course, John Mollo was the costume designer. He was an expert on, well, British military uniforms generally. And one of the extraordinary things about Star Wars, the Imperials look military, they look smart, but it's very difficult to work out which country it's based on. Again, Mollo was enough of an expert to include elements from around Europe, but not make it too obvious. And you can see how brilliant it is by comparing it to other sci-fi of a similar era. The sets, just moving on to say the architectural surprises that the British Council talked about, the sets are ingenious. A lot of the crew members were very, very old hands at Doctor Who. And so, if you read American accounts of Star Wars, they'll say what a tiny budget it had and what a huge amount of money it made. From the British crew's point of view, this was a huge budget. They'd been working on Doctor Who TV shows for a long, long time, in which you might have just one or two corridors and try and make it look like a whole spaceship. Suddenly, you have a much larger budget by comparison to that. And they did make ingenious sets with very, very small changes, able to make it look like endless Death Star corridors with a very limited amount of resources. So then you have costumiers, you have the robots, which of course are robots. They are mechanical devices, they are on-set things. You might also have an element of class in Star Wars and class structure. I feel the British actors naturally bring that in. So there's something about Grand Moff Tarkin, played of course by Peter Cushing, which has an element of the class structure in the UK, especially when he's talking to, well, his brother officers. There's something about it which is quite different from what I'd normally see in American movies. I actually think that combination of the hero actors and the supporting cast actually adds a great deal. So whether it's the sets, the costumes, I think that is reflected. I do think there's a considerable cultural contribution. So I'm going to go with 3 out of 4. Generous, perhaps, but I'll say 3 out of 4. So, section C. There's 4 sections. Cultural hubs. This is broken down into C1, A, B and C. C1A, at least 50% of the principal photography or special effects takes place in the UK. B is at least 50% of the visual special effects takes place in the UK. C, an extra 2 points can be awarded if at least 80% of the principal photography or visual special effects takes place in the UK. And C2 is about the music and audio recording. So C1, at least 50% of the principal photography or special effects takes place in the UK. Absolutely yes. As I say, many crew members thought it was glorified Doctor Who, but the majority of the film is really set on spaceship corridors, Death Star corridors, and so on. It is a big production, but it's largely set bound. You do have bits set in the desert and so on, but a lot of it very quickly moves to sets. Of course, the problem we get into very quickly, at least 50% of the visual special effects takes place in the UK. Well, now we're talking about digital kind of post-production, but at the time special effects were considered very much the things that were happening on the set. So, for example, the set where you've got the Millennium Falcon cockpit, which is basically in a cradle being hit by multiple crew members' brooms, as, to shake the whole thing about. So it's not just them rocking about in their own chairs. You see the shadows moving and so on, because the whole set is moving around. Equally, all the doors opening and shutting, you get all the squibs, the explosives, the guns firing, all of that is considered in the 70s definition as special effects. And of course the robots. which caused endless trouble for the crew members, and of course all the people dressed up as robots who can't see out and can very easily topple over and can't really put their hands in front of them when they fall down. So a lot of this, I'm going to say this is one of the stronger areas in Section C, the cultural hub, very much the on-set contribution. As for 80% of principal photography, you've got filming in Tunisia, you've got some filming in Death Valley. So move on to Section C, Part 2, music recording, audio, post-production, and so on. John Williams, of course, is an American composer, but he's ordinarily resident in the UK, which is okay. It passes the BFI. A kind of additional notes section proves this. Of course, it does amuse me. John Barry is a Brit in the USA, has composed the other soundtrack to my life, but of course that does count because he's a British citizen. So an American citizen in the UK counts as a pass in this section, and a British citizen resident in the US apparently passes. And of course the music was recorded in the UK. Section D, the briefest one to go through, is all about cultural practitioners. You get 1 point for each of the following: director, scriptwriter, producer, composer, lead actors, majority of cast, key staff, and majority of crew. Well, obviously the director and scriptwriter's out because that's George Lucas. He's American from Modesto, California. Producer is out. They're all American. Composer, 1 point. An American resident in the UK counts, which amuses me. Lead actors, I was curious because a lot of the characters named on the film poster, they are British. Perhaps when we're looking at lead actors, 3 is the maximum for lead. It's very clearly the 3 Americans who came over. The majority of the cast, however, are British, even if they're putting on American voices, an element of Band of Brothers there, which I always thought was a bit funny when I'm watching Band of Brothers. Here you have a bunch of English people standing around in an English field, all talking in American accents, and it seems very American. Anyway, T7 on the BFI index is key staff: lead cinematographer, lead production designer, lead costume designer. You do have editor and sound design, of course they were American. Back to lead visual effects supervisor, lead hair, very important for Princess Leia, and makeup supervisor. So here we have a whole series of people who are getting points after points on this index. Majority of crew, very definitely a British crew. Of course, we can have a look at this just at the Oscars. So the original Star Wars film, of course, got Best Art Direction, Set Decoration. Well, Set Decoration would be the British crew. Best Costume Design, again, John Mollo, so that would be very definitely a yes for the UK. Best Sound, that's Ben Burt. Best Film Editing, again, that's Marcia Lucas. Best Effects, Visual Effects, again, if it's on set, it's our lot. If it's the post special effects, that's the amazing industrial light and magic that was created for this movie and has done so many movies since. Of course, Best Music, that is recorded in the UK and therefore passes on theirs. So there are 35 points available, and to pass you need 18. Quick sip from my cup of tea as I work out. Is Star Wars British? Is it set in the UK? No. Are the lead characters British? No. But is the film based on British or EA subject matter? I would say without European fairy tales, especially British fairy tales, Star Wars simply wouldn't exist. Even though Joseph Campbell tried to look at the whole world, even though the Japanese influence is very much spoken about, I would say overwhelmingly we're talking about British fairy tales, and Japanese fairy tales understood through a very British context. So I'm going to give that the 3 out of 4. Original dialogue recorded in a UK or UK indigenous language, I'm going to say that's half. So that's 3 out of the 6 possible points. So at 6 points overall from Section A. Cultural contribution demonstrates British creativity, British heritage, diversity. Again, I think that's absolutely true. Again, from the costumes, from the set design, even just from the way the crew made so much from what, again, a lot of Hollywood reporters talk about a tiny, tiny budget, but to them it felt like a lot more. They thought, if this is what we can do for Doctor Who, just think what we can do with this money. So I do say this is worth 3 out of the 4 available points. So we've got the 3 from A3, we've got the 3 from A4, we've got the 3 from Section B. Now Section C, we've got 2 points, because more than 50% of principal photography was in the UK. 50% of the visual special effects, okay. Again, that 50% I'm going to say is the on-set stuff. Music recording, yep. Composer, yep. Majority of cast, yep. key staff, yep, and majority of crew. So, how much does that give us? Total? 18. The bare minimum. Even there, I'm arguing a bit. Star Wars definitely has a significant British contribution. Is it a wholly British film? I doubt it. Very, very much. As I say, I think a lot of it is actually the interplay between a lot of the American backers and the American creators and the British crew and the British designers and creatives and so on. I actually think the international element is hugely important. So I'll say Britain has a significant contribution. Okay, meets the BFI bare minimum if I argue it as best as I can. And of course, some of the later films moved on to film in Australia, and you get great contributions from Australians, New Zealanders. It's really interesting as an international hub. But I'm going to say this rarely grows out of Arthurian legends, a very British understanding of fairy tales, and a good bit of British filmmaking, if not total. So, it's borderline. Is Star Wars British? Breaking news. It's borderline. Well, I hope you enjoyed this special episode on Star Wars. Thank you very, very much for listening. And of course, may the Force be with you.